Welcome to the Mental Insights Podcast, a conversation aimed at understanding all sides of mental health, addiction recovery, and homelessness. Each interview will include one's personal experiences and insights, or an expert's advice and knowledge within one of these fields. The goal is to promote awareness, guidance, and support for anyone who is affected by these challenges. Thank you all for listening. Welcome to the Mental Insights Podcast. This is your host, Brennan Catuli. We are here today for Season 2, Episode number 6 with Robin Marvel. Robin is a woman who has overcome the odds after facing domestic, drug, emotional, and mental abuse within her childhood. Robin took her experiences and brought them into a place of healing, learning, and passion for helping others through similar experiences. Robin is now a multi-published author and motivational speaker in the field of self-development. Robin joins the Mental Insights Podcast to speak about healing from childhood trauma and the importance of personal development. Robin, thank you for taking this time out to be here with me today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a great opportunity. I appreciate it.
I'm really excited to dive deep within, specific within this first part of childhood trauma, as it is a huge cause of what people are facing within mental health challenges today. And, to bring about just the impact that it is having within our community, within our society, I just want to bring about this statistic from Recognized Trauma. And they have done a statistic saying that 26% of children in the United States will witness or experience a traumatic event before they turn 4 years old. So within this statistic, just to bring about what really childhood trauma is and, just the severity of it, can you speak about what childhood trauma is and the effects it could have on people, given that it's happening to young ones, even at the age of 4 and under?
Well, absolutely. Any kind of trauma that a child faces, there can be domestic abuse, there can be sexual abuse, there can be physical abuse, but as well as mental. And I think that kind of gets overlooked, the mental abuse of trauma that happens to children. When I was growing up, I had a really tumultuous childhood, and there was a lot of addiction and a lot of abuse that went on, as far as watching my mother be beat countless times by my father, parental kidnapping, a lot of homelessness. So all of those instances, even though as a kid, I didn't see them as so damaging, because when you're a kid, you're kind of just going with the flow a lot of times, unless it's really super severe. And so that's just different situations that can have such a lasting impact and create abandonment issues and mental health issues and also physical issues. This childhood trauma leads to a lot of physical issues in the future, because you're making a lot of decisions based off of that hurt that you experienced then. And so it has a very, very, very strong, astounding effect on our adulthood, what we go through as children.
Thank you for bringing all that up, because it's something that I do want to speak more about, since that it's not just an event or an experience that just impacts you right at the moment. You're speaking about how this can translate into things later on in our life, whether it be types of, emotional responses, behaviors, as well as substance abuse. There's many different aspects of how this can translate within your life later down the line. And what have been some things that you've been able to identify throughout years after you've personally experienced it, or even what you've seen within society today? What are kind of the events or some of the behavioral responses people have due to severe childhood trauma? For myself, I know that a lot of people do go to substance abuse within experiencing a childhood trauma. From your perspective, what do you really see throughout the translation later down the line within someone's life?
Well, I absolutely think that it affects our self-worth 100%. And I'm speaking from my experience growing up in that hectic environment and the chaos and the trauma things that I faced. I grew up without a sense of self-worth. And so as a young adult, I continued on that pattern. And I ended up making some really poor choices. And I was addicted to alcohol when I was 15 years old. And I was like basically a drunk. I was drinking every single night at 15. And I ended up sexually abused by a male friend. And then I ended up pregnant. at the age of 16 as well. So a lot of my choices, not a lot, all of my choices were made based on how I felt, which without growing up with any kind of stability or foundation and just living in that traumatic experiences over and over and over, I grew up with, no real confident structure. And so that has rippled out into my own adulthood and young adulthood. And I think that happens in society. One of the biggest things that I see all the way that people use their childhood trauma as an excuse to live a non-productive life and to make poor decisions. There's that show Intervention. I don't know if you've seen that before, but that show, every single case, the person who's addicted is referring back to, well, my parents were this and this happened in my childhood, and so that's the reason why I'm doing the drugs, and that's the reason why I'm doing this. And I believe that that's valid. I believe that just like I said, I became addicted to alcohol at a young age because of the trauma that I'd been through. But I also know that you cannot use that as an excuse for the rest of your life to be non-productive and to stay addicted to things and to not kind of take a hold of your life and live your truth. And I think that definitely is something that I see as a societal problem, is we're busy making excuses. And on top of that, society's making excuses for us. I mean, I don't know how many times I've did this myself. I'm guilty of this, where somebody's had something horrific happen in their childhood and then they're making poor decisions as an adult. And we're like, yeah, but remember what happened? Their mom didn't love them, or their mom left them, or their dad was abusive or whatever. And so we create this whole victim mentality, and that ends up limiting the people that have went through childhood trauma, and it just kind of keeps the patterns going, and then they pass them on to the next generation, not knowing or knowing, and then it just continues to snowball from there, and then nobody's progressing, and it just kind of keeps you stuck where you're at. Does that make sense?
It certainly does, and it's something that I'm glad you brought up, because it is, I think, an issue that many people do use as kind of this, this safety measure, and you're saying it's kind of just this excuse and this answer that they'll always be able to use if they're behaving in the wrong manner. And I really want to understand and help my listeners gauge, especially if they haven't experienced something such as a childhood trauma, of why does a childhood trauma cause this self-destructive behavior? Because we're speaking a lot about how our emotions, our self-worth, our thoughts and behaviors are drastically changing based on one experience. Can you speak a little bit about how, one such traumatic event can cause such self-destructive behavior, not only once, but to continue within the cycle?
Absolutely. Childhood trauma it is something that is so traumatic and is such an experience for someone. When you're at a young age, you're being shaped, you're being molded, you're learning your truth, you're learning the person that you're going to be. And if you're going through these constant unstable moments and you're constantly scared, or you're constantly feeling like people are leaving you, you're building your character, you're building who you are, and those character traits translate into your young adulthood and then into your adulthood, unless you break the cycle, which so many people do, but so many people do not do that. And so one traumatic event can change your emotional makeup. And unless you find a way to heal with that, and a way to use it as a lesson versus as an excuse or as a reason to go on a behavioral mishap, whatever it is that you do, the childhood trauma definitely will impact that. And it just takes one event. I mean, if you think about it, it takes one event to change us as adults. It takes one event to change you as a child. And so if you're never feeling that, like for me, we were unstable. We were homeless more than we were as a child growing up until I was like 16 years old. My life was spent in station wagons, living on the side of the river, tents, hotels, wherever we could find to live. So I never had that foundation. I never had that I'm stable, I know where I'm going to sleep at night. There was always a worry that went on as far back as I could remember. And so for me, that translated into kind of a very, I don't want to say spontaneous because that's not the word for it. So very impulsive behavior in my young adulthood, because I didn't know how to be stable. All I knew was how to be in this chaos. And so that I had to learn how to reprogram myself, and I had to learn how to find ways to heal that. And that's a lot what I talk about in my book, is finding ways to heal those things, because it can last your whole entire life if you let it. And it can make it, I mean, it actually has health risks. There's a ACE test, which was developed in 1978, and you take it and you get scored on it. And based on your scores, there's the statistical evidence from all of this research that's been done by the founder of the quiz. And all of that research, there's physical things that happen from people who suffered from childhood trauma and never healed. So I mean, it's really an impactful thing, the way that your childhood was.
Thank you for that, Robin. And it's really something that I think is something to truly uncover, is that, you're speaking about how one event can drastically change as a child and as an adult, especially when you're a child. You're going through so many different things in terms of development. You haven't even fully developed your mind. You haven't understood what types of, thoughts, behaviors, actions are so important, and how to even conduct yourself properly. Given, some people experience this younger than 4, even when it's below 20 years old, it's still such a profound effect within people's lives, even at any measure. But when your brain's not fully developed, when you don't truly understand how to process your emotions, it causes an even bigger ordeal, because it could bring in the aspect of you thinking, just, this is who you are, this is your worth, exactly as you were saying
Oh
before.
yeah.
That
Hmm.
self-worth aspect completely diminishes. And how does trauma affect our mental health? How can that drastically change someone's, whether it's their belief system or whether it's just the way their brain processes themselves and sees themselves?
Well, I'll speak from my own experience on that, because it definitely, absolutely, 100% affects your mental health. You're learning who you can trust as a child, and that's huge. That's very important in every relationship that you have in your life, no matter what age you are. And so when you're learning that you can't trust and you can't depend on anybody, you develop these traits of guarded. You start being guarded, and then you start developing more of maybe pulling back from society, or pulling back from your peers, or whatever like that. And from my experience, I I learned flight. We have the two responses, fight or flight. And my response has always been to flight. So because of the way I live, like, there was instances, I'll just share with you. I was in second grade. So I think, was that like 8 years old or so? And my mom woke us up at 3 in the morning and said, "We're moving to Michigan. Grab 3 things. Let's go." And me and my sisters were like, "What is going on?" This was insane to us. And at least it was to me. But when you're that age, you don't really have a choice. You do what your parents do. And so we loaded into the back of my mom's boyfriend's truck, and we moved to Michigan. And it was that sporadic. We didn't get to say goodbye to anybody. We didn't get to bring our belongings. Not that we had that much, but still, what we did have was, super valuable, because we didn't have a lot. And so it was kind of the same pattern, because that same thing happened once we were in Michigan. Woke up and said, "We're moving to Michigan," or "We're moving back to California. Grab your things." So I never really learned how to deal with any kind of real life situations. It was like, leave, run, go to the next place. I was never taught any real coping mechanisms for dealing with like finances, or dealing with an issue where you weren't getting along with someone. It was just kind of leave the situation. So that's the same way that I process things as a young adult. So if I got into any situations that weren't comfortable for me, or that made me upset, it was just like, flight. I'm out of here. I'm out of here. And I would just leave. And so I had to really learn that that's not a healthy way, or a positive way to deal with any situation, to just leave it, trying to heal it and figure it out. And if it's an argument with your significant other, discuss it. And so that was huge for me. That really was a huge experience for me. And then it did affect my mental health. And I still know that I have abandonment issues. And I know that I have a little bit of trust issues. I've come a really long way, but that's something that takes years of healing, and it's consistent. It's not a flip of a switch, or it just happened yesterday and now I'm great today. It definitely is something that you have to work through, and really stay focused on and determined to keep that process, and keep healing, and keep moving forward in your life in a productive way.
Such a valuable insight, Robin. I appreciate you speaking upon that, because for many people, especially, who we've spoken about before in terms of, these recurring issues, and they can't break that cycle, whether it's, continuously abusing substances or so forth. You look at this aspect of, all right, do I put the work in now? Do I put the few years in now to make the next 50 better within my life? Or do I just accept what my fate is and then use these substances to try to, cope? And I think this is kind of the real determination of people who experience trauma. It's always the hardest thing for them to say, all right, I need to do the work now, since it's such a painful and agonizing approach of going back into the experiences that you had and trying to face some of these thoughts, some of these experiences and behaviors that you haven't truly learned to improve and truly learn to understand the way that your mind and body is working within a traumatic experience that you had. And I think that's something
Right. Mhm.
that people, need to kind of just open up to and say, all right, if I take these next 5 years to make the next 15 better, it will help me out such in the long run, rather than if just these next 15, these next 20, I stay where I am and I don't use this growth. And I think, we will speak about upon that in the next part of this, but I think it's just so important for people to know that having this, sense of growth in order to take that next step is so important. And even as you said, there's still things that we can work on today, and you're not gonna completely get over your childhood trauma, or you're not going to get over any type of challenge that you have within your life just over one day. It's all a healing process. And even
Absolutely.
even when you're 80, you could learn something new about yourself and something that you could have done better back in your life earlier. But, that's kind of the
Right.
thing. Are you determined to make that next step? Are you determined to learn more about yourself, or do you want to be comfortable with who you are and not change? And I think that's something that's profound that people need to understand, especially within, the conversations and the topics that you try to exemplify within, the people that you speak with.
Right. And a lot of it, like I said, I'm a firm believer that everything we do and all the choices we make have a lot to do with what we think we're worth. And I was speaking on how I grew up with no sense of self worth. And so if you don't know that you're worth anything, you don't know. And I'm telling you, when you start to figure that out, it changes your entire life because, like I said, I was out of control. I was drinking every single night. I was just, really being a terrible mother. I was just not at all taking life and taking advantage of life because I was a victim of circumstance. I'd always watched my mom be one. I've always watched everybody in my life be a victim of circumstance. So I was continuing on that cycle. And I remember when I decided to start making the life changes, I was 23 years old, and I just come home from a week binge of alcohol. I never really did drugs, but I was just on the alcohol really heavily. And I was sitting in my living room and I was looking around, and I remember thinking, this is not the way I want my story to end. And so in that moment, I was like, I have to start making some changes. So I started reading some self-development, personal self-help books. And one of the books that I had was called The Art of Happiness. And my aunt had given it to me years ago, and I never read it. I just, it wasn't fit for my life at that time. And I picked it up and I started reading it. And one of the chapters was like, you are responsible for your life. You are responsible for your happiness. It is not the responsibility of your significant other, of your children, of your workplace to make you happy. You hold that in your hands. And I was like, what? Like, I'm in charge of my own life? That concept had never actually been something that had ever entered my psyche. And it may sound silly to some people who have had that, but if you don't know, you don't know. You do what you know, and so it was so powerful for me to realize that. And then I was like, well, if I'm in charge of this life, game on. Like, I'm going to live it to the fullest, and I'm going to make this life badass. And that's when I started making personal changes, and that's when I started writing books. And that was when I started to heal and look at everything and go, you know what? I am worth something. And that was life changing for me.
That's incredible, and it really shows the, change in perspective. One little thing can make that drastic change, and it can lead to such substantial things. It creates a positive cycle within your life, which is so important. And for some children who face these traumatic experiences at a young age and may not have the resources, or maybe they just haven't been in touch with somebody who could help them, for some childs that experience this, what ways could we really assist these children who experience the trauma? How can we identify someone who's experienced this? What are kind of the steps that we could take to reduce some of these experiences that happen?
I think one of the main things we could do is listen, because so many kids are exhibiting destructive behaviors. They're being self-destructive, whether it's cutting, whether it's, they're being bullied or they're bullying other people or they're threatening suicide. So many kids are being self-destructive, but we're so busy trying to get them to quiet down so that we don't have to face the issue instead of listening and being able to help them and get them the help that they need. We're more like, oh, just mind your business and be nice, and just we try to ignore it, I think, more as a society, and as parents. A lot of parents don't want to face that their kids have issues, and they don't want to take responsibility themselves because their kids are having these issues, which is crazy, because as a family unit you could really band together and then help your child and help yourself heal together. Life happens and we all go through things and we don't always make the best choices, and that doesn't make us bad people. It just means that's where we were at that place in our life, and we have the choice now to heal that. Well, our kids are going to catch the shrapnel from our own wounds that we're bringing from our childhood, and we're going to pass them on to them in their childhood, and then they're going to have their own if they're living any kind of, trauma at all. So it's so powerful to actually listen. And I think that that's something that the public school system needs to really look at, is these kids that are struggling, and you can tell the ones that are creating the issues in school for themselves, and it's really a cry for attention to me. And that's where we need to make the impact. We need to grab these kids at a young age, teach them self-worth, teach them that it's okay if you're having a bad day, and it's okay to have anger, and it's okay to feel upset because your parents got in a fight last night. But let's talk about a game plan to heal it and address it versus just brushing it under the rug and pretending it's not happening, so we as adults don't get uncomfortable and have to deal with it.
That's a great example. And I think, we need to look at it differently, like you're saying, is, trying to find new ways that we can incorporate, listening and other approaches to provide the right resources. And in terms of that, are there any resources that were available to you as you were experiencing this? Or what were some resources that you wish were available to you while you were going through this period?
Well, I have to tell you that one of the greatest things that made such an impact on me as a child when I was going through all of the trauma and the homelessness and the abuse was that there were certain adults that actually were listening and were showing me compassion. And that made a huge difference. And I still remember them to this day. And so for me, a resource that I would like to see available is more mental health resources in public schools. I have children and I homeschool them, but the public school system lacks that. And I think that is just so, I mean, I know a lot of people think that that's really important, and I'm right on board with that. I also think that I think that for me, a resource, I wrote a book, and that was how I started writing books actually, was because I wanted something to give to these kids to build a foundation and build some self-worth and help them to realize that there's nothing wrong with them, even if they're having an off day, and just build some empowerment within. And I searched and searched for something online. I couldn't find it. And so I was like, you know what, I'm going to write it. I contacted a publisher. He was like, that's a great idea. Let's do it. And so that was how my first book was written, because I wanted a resource where kids, like when I was younger, I could have picked it up and did the book myself, because it's more of like a workbook format, or you could do it with a parent. But kids need that reinforcement. They need to know that, it's okay. It's okay that you're going through this trauma, and we can work through it. And they don't always have that option. So I wish that when I was a kid, I would have had more positive influences to look at. And that might have helped me in knowing I was worth something. I would have liked somebody to tell me I was worth something as a kid. I think that that's something really powerful you can do as an adult, even to your nieces and nephews or your kids' friends or your friends' kids. And it doesn't have to be weird, just encouragement, like great job on that. And I'm not talking about the fluff encouragement where everybody gets a participation award. I'm talking about really telling someone that just the way you are, you might be unique and you might like to do things differently than everybody else that you know. that's okay. It's okay to be true to who you are. Because I also think the more we are limiting our children and the more we're stifling people's, like you can't dye your hair and you can't get your nose pierced and you can't do this because we're the adult and we said so, the more we're creating trauma for these children. So we really have to realize that they're just little people, they're just, and I think that there's such an outdated, we're the adults, so do as we say and speak when spoken to. And I think that exists still in a lot of family dynamics. And I think that definitely has an astounding effect on the trauma that a child goes through and how they embrace the world.
I completely agree, Rob, and I thank you for that. And it's definitely a good perspective and a good identification for people to hear and understand what kind of the steps we need to take forth within how we're going to bring about and develop and heal children throughout many traumatic experiences that they're facing today. And especially at such a young age, we need to provide these correct resources, these effective resources in order to take those next steps within their life. I think this is a great time to transition from childhood trauma over to personal development. So this will wrap up the part 1 episode with Robin. So I'd love to thank you all for listening to this episode. You can check the show notes to get more information on Robin's work, to her website, and to some of the information that we've been speaking about in terms of statistics, in terms of resources. And be sure to tune in to the next part of the episode where we'll be speaking about personal development, more about the book that Robin wrote, and you will hear more about what steps you can take, whether you've experienced a childhood trauma or whether you're just in a challenging situation within your life today. So thank you all for listening to the first part of episode number 6 on season 2. Thank you all for listening to today's episode of the Mental Insights Podcast. Make sure to reach out to today's guest or myself if you need any advice, guidance, or support in your life today. Please be sure to like, subscribe, and review to this podcast so we know what you thought of this episode. I look forward to being in touch with you all in the next episode. I hope you all have a wonderful day.